Well, this really isn't the podcast, but it's kind of the occasional conversation we have at theofantastique.com whenever an author or individual comes across my feed and my radar of great interest. And I recently came across LMK Sheppard. And I'm going to read a little bit of the bio from the back of her book. She is a film, television, and media lecturer at Palomar College. She published an article on Rosemary's Baby for a special edition of Film Journal entitled Screening the Supernatural, and she lives in Norwich, Norfolk. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, Norwich, Norfolk. Exactly.
In the UK. And we're going to be talking today about this wonderful book right here, Faith Horror, Cinematic Visions of Satanism, Paganism and Witchcraft, 1966 to 1978. Welcome to the conversation at Theofantastique.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let me just say at the beginning, let me glow for a moment about the subject matter of your book and why this is so important to me. I grew up, I'm a child of the 1970s, grew up in Northern California, in the United States, very much a child of the time. There was a local creature feature host, and many of these films would run Friday and Saturday evenings, and my brother and I would always seek these out at the local theater when it wasn't on television. And so I have a great appreciation for these films and this subject matter in terms of nostalgia, but also as an adult, going back and being involved in religious studies and looking in particular and being involved in dialogue with people in paganism as well as Satanism. This takes on a whole new area of significance for me. So this book, well, somehow it missed my my radar. My attention. It was Peter Laws who wrote the foreword, posted on Facebook, and I was like, wow, I got to track that down, and I did. So it's fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Can you begin by telling why the personal as well as academic interest for you in this subject matter?
Yeah, so much like you, I'm a child of the 1970s. I was born in 69, so just at that kind of crux moment. And much like you also, I came to watching these horror movies on the creature feature Saturday nights, as well as going to the cinema with my mother. In the UK, children under the age of 18 can't see any kind of certificate 18 film, regardless of their parents' permission. But as you know, in the US, it's absolutely all, as long as your parents give you permission, they can take you to see whatever film they want. And so I went to see a lot of these movies, being 13, 14 years old, and was really, really drawn to them, just because of their spookiness, but also because of the kind of some of the messages that they offered. And when I came to the UK to pursue my PhD, I really wanted to focus on these group of films because I felt like they were doing something very different from what the traditional horror movie, uh, previous to mid 1960s was doing. And really wanted to focus on them because I knew that as my PhD, I was going to be focusing on them and watching them a lot. And then a publisher, McFarland, happened to reach out to me and said, would you like to turn this into a book? Of course I would. And so that's how Faith Horror came to fruition, basically.
Fantastic. So it sounds like you got a lot of overlap there. So this was, if I'm understanding your story correctly, this was the book was kind of the outgrowth of your PhD research.
Exactly.
Right.
So I came to the UK. I'm obviously, even though I'm in Norwich, Norfolk, UK, I am. You can probably tell by my accent, I'm East Anglian. No, I'm from the US. I was born and raised in New York. So I came here to do my PhD, and then this eventually turned into the book.
Now, how did you come to focus on that? The subtitle of your book is very specific, 1966 to 1978.
Right. Yeah. So I was looking. So whenever you do any sort of research, you always have to kind of set your parameters in terms of the years. And there were a lot of interesting shifts that were happening in religion right about that time. We had the Second Vatican Council, which basically opened up Catholicism to a much more, you can't really say liberal, but it definitely liberalized Catholicism in the sense that they allowed for masses to be held in the vernacular rather than in Latin. You had parish priests being given more and more responsibility. And even though there still was very much a hierarchy, that hierarchy was giving power on lower levels, all the way down the chain. So it was opening up an opportunity for more dialogue to be happening even in the Catholic Church. Now, on the other hand, right about this time in like the mid 1960s, you had this amazing opening up of other religions. So you had the popularization of Satanism by people like Kenneth Anger and, Mick Jagger, and the Rolling Stones were releasing albums called like Sympathy for the Devil, right around the same time. You had Anton LaVey publishing the Satanic Bible and actually being published by popular press and not just by kind of a fringe publisher. So all of these things kind of created a perfect storm. And when you add Wicca into the mix and this idea of the kind of hippie movement spurning off this sort of interest in returning to nature, and the Wicca movement, it kind of created a perfect storm for dialogues to open up, where you didn't just have either the kind of the right-minded Christianity or wrong-minded everyone else. You had different these dialogues definitely opening up this moment. And so I focused on 66 being the time when the end of the Second Vatican Council, and when the first film that I talk about in the book, The Witches, really kind of that when the book version of that was actually published.
That's one of the facets of your book that interests me, is that kind of dialogical approach between the traditions. Now, one of the interesting things for me was the title. It says faith horror. I think many readers, given the assumptions that they have, you talked about, this Christian hegemony that we still battle, particularly in the United States, but also in the broader Western world. When they think of faith horror, they would likely be thinking mainly of the Christian faith tradition. But obviously, you're not dealing with that. So how did the title come about, and how does that play into your thesis?
Yeah, so when I started looking, so I was looking at these films, and I was looking at them as I suggested earlier, because starting pretty much with Rosemary's Baby as being sort of the kind of the touchstone for me, even though The Witches happened slightly earlier, The Witches being a Hammer horror film. But Rosemary's Baby was really kind of like my touchstone. In Rosemary's Baby, and then subsequent films after Rosemary's Baby, you see a lot of really, really interesting things happening. The first thing that you see is that the Satanists win in Rosemary's Baby, right? So in most horror films up until this particular point, you have the Satanists, or basically non-Christians, are the antagonists, and they are vanquished basically by somebody who either takes up the mantle of Christianity, or at the very least opens up the possibility of belief, which allows them to manipulate the icons of Christianity. So you have them, the even Christopher Lee being defeated, or Bela Lugosi being defeated by somebody holding up the cross and and banishing them back into the underworld and back into the fiery pit of hell. And so the films usually end on this note, with good vanquishing evil, good being Christians, or at least people who are able to manipulate the icons of Christianity. And then you have the evildoers being non-Christians. And so all of these, the lumped into, are Satanism, paganism, and witchcraft. And in these films, really, all three of them are equated as being, so even in Rosemary's Baby, which I think is kind of a seminal point in these films, you still have them playing with this idea of witches as being Satanists, and they kind of use the two terms interchangeably. So she gets the book, All of Them Witches, but it's clear that they're Satanists. Um, but at least they're opening up the room for these, Satanism and witchcraft to be people that, on the surface, really, you have this older couple. The man lives in the house that he was raised in. He's taking on his father's work, conjuring the living devil. You have his wife, Minnie, by his side and helping him on. You have his faithful congregation there supporting him, and they are practicing their faith that they are wedded to, and they are very, very serious about, that they have devoted their lives to. And I would argue that really, from the point of view of at least my perspective in faith horror, they really aren't the bad guys in this. The bad guy is Guy, I would argue. I think he's the antagonist of this particular film. And what's interesting about Guy is Guy doesn't hold any belief whatsoever, right? He is a hedonist. And so he's willing to do anything it takes to further his career, to further his hedonistic self-love, and even selling his wife's body to these Satanists, right? And because Rosemary, a fallen Catholic, buys into this whole kind of, basically looks to her husband and to these patriarchal figures as being trustworthy. She puts her trust into them, rather than putting her trust into any kind of faith mechanism, which would ground her, which would give her a support network. She and Guy are sort of out there. They exist in New York. They're all by themselves. There's no family to speak of. And so it's no wonder that the Satanists win, because they have the congregation, they have their faith, they have their belief, they have their support network. And I thought that was a really, really interesting moment in cinema, especially because you have it being produced by Roman Polanski, who is an iconic, foreign, you have the foreign kind of film, art film. You have a very strong independent American film in John Cassavetes. You have really strong, stalwart Hollywood, old Hollywood stars that play Hutch and Roman Castevet. So you really have this amazing kind of way in which this film not only breaks the boundaries of traditional horror in that way, but also appeals to the widest possible audience. And then it's, of course, produced by William Castle, who is this iconic B director. So you have everybody being roped into this idea, and it really is the touchstone for then a series of other films that came out, ending with 1978 with The Omen, that really play with these same ideas of the fact that the alternative religions aren't the evil guys. What the evil guys are, or what the bad guys are, if you can even, well, if, and that's problematic, we can play around with this notion, is the fact is a lack of belief, is a focus on the self and on self-interest, whether it be capitalism, whether it be hedonism, rather than being grounded in something that is a belief in something outside of the self. And I think this is kind of what the 1970s really is iconically all about, isn't it? It's the me generation. And so these films speak to that, but in a very interesting, I think, and unusual way. Faith horror is about this idea that we need faith, we need community, we need belief communities. If you're just existing on your own, you're kind of doomed to fail.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I never really connected the dots until you mentioned Guy being the most negative character. He's willing to use everybody, including his wife, for his own gains, and he's got this radical hedonism. But what's interesting about that is the most popular expression of Satanism in pop culture of the time was the Church of Satan from Anton LaVey, which pursued this radical kind of hedonism there. So do you it's just curious that the film would treat hedonism in that way. Was it, do you think there would have been an element for hedonism's okay as long as it's connected to some kind of faith and working towards some kind of end?
Yeah. Well, what Anton LaVey, what's interesting about LaVey is that he kind of rides the fence, as it were, because he does definitely propose this idea of self-love and self-gratification. However, he argues that what the me generation and this idea of just pursuing self or self-love lacks is the sort of the elements of religion that people need. So the ritual. So what LaVey is doing with with Satanism really is he is kind of speaking to the time in some way by suggesting that Christianity, by being kind of prohibitive, is in some ways um, doesn't really meet the needs of humanity anymore. But what religion does offer humanity that is very important is this idea of ritual, of 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 this communal working out of these ideas. And so that's what the Church of Satan is all about. It's taking hedonism and ritualizing it and putting it into kind of a communal practice, I would argue. And so you see, um, yeah, so I what's interesting about Rosemary's Baby and about a lot of these films though is that they actually portray Satanism even in like the Omen, when it's actually, there's no bones about it, they are Satanists. um is they portray it as being a faith that ultimately you are willing to sacrifice yourself for your faith. And that is something that maybe Anton LaVey doesn't necessarily touch on, but these films definitely bring to the fore. So they maybe don't portray Satanism in a completely follow kind of by the book, as it were.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's always it's interesting how many times conservative Christians, at least in America, will go to cinema and expect that that's the treatments they see of a given religion on screen is either authentic or it's not authentic,
Mhm.
right? There's no such thing as artistic license and drawing
Yeah.
upon something and running with it and that kind of a thing. It's interesting to me that if we want to understand what's going on in the present, we have to be good students of history. And when I did my graduate thesis on Burning Man Festival in the
Oh,
United
interesting.
States, I went back, and part of that research was looking at the impact of the counterculture and how that continues to
Mhm.
impact things like Burning Man and so on. Can you touch on, you mentioned this a little bit, but what are some things percolating in the counterculture that then surface in these films and in alternative religions and become a facet of these horror expressions?
Yeah. So I touch upon this a lot when I talk about the Wicker Man, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, it's a film that was made in the 70s. It was produced by with American backing by British Lion. It was written by Anthony Shaffer, who was a famous screenplay writer of alternative horror films, and directed by actually a commercial director, Robin Hardy, and starring Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee was wanting to break away from being Dracula and explore alternative venues, really. And so they made this film called The Wicker Man. It was set in one of the Scottish Hebridean islands, and it's about this group of pagans who their crops are failing, and so they decide that they are going to need to have a sacrifice in order to have their crops succeed. And I'm not going to give too much away. I don't know if like spoilers are, but they end up having their sacrifice, and actually a perfect sacrifice at that. And so what's interesting, however, is the fact that with the Wicker Man, what you have is kind of a dichotomy. So you have the person who's being sacrificed as being somebody who very much holds to their beliefs. And then you have the people of Summersisle who are also very religious and very much wedded to their pagan system. And so it's almost like a war of faiths. And at the end, when the sacrifice occurs, I always ask myself, is the fact that the character gets sacrificed, this Christian gets sacrificed at the end of the film, is it something that is it kind of an unfulfilling, unhappy ending, because the character never did fit in with his environment in the 1970s. He was always being chided for his beliefs. And then you have people of Summersisle obviously having to be isolated on an island because their practices are antithetical to, if not to what we consider to be right, in the fact that you're going to have to kill somebody at the end of the day, right? And murder is not something that is condoned really for any purposes, at least legally speaking. So they have to do this practices in secret. So I looked at the Wicker Man, and I was thinking to myself, okay, well, this ties very much into this idea, as you were saying, about the hippie movement, right? And this idea of going back to the earth and things like that. But what's interesting about the paganism that's expressed in the Wicker Man, and also in a couple of other films. So you have the Season of the Witch, which was a film, kind of a very, almost like a lost film, directed by George Romero, who's more famous for doing Night of the Living Dead. And then you have a TV series that stars Betty Davis, called The Dark Secret of Harvest Home. Again, and these are all kind of Wicca pagan films. But what's interesting about all of these is the fact that, at least for the Wicker Man, the fact that becoming going back to the earth doesn't necessarily mean I am going to go out into the wilderness and explore, like, and try to find myself. What paganism is for these films is adhering to a very strong set of beliefs that must be, like I said, must be adhered to. So, and it follows very much, the kind of the traditional paganism that is in kind of early texts. This idea of, you worship Mother Earth, you have to hold to these kind of ritualistic ceremonies that are being practiced and stuff like this. There's a leader that guides you through these processes and things. So whereas in kind of the back to earth movement, it's kind of about exploring self and finding yourself within this process. These films also adhere to this idea of it being something that is very communally practiced and very, in some ways, kind of conservative, which breaks what initially I thought these films were going to be about. Because I thought initially the reason why these films came about was because of this idea of freedom to do whatever you want, freedom to express yourself, and whatever kind of almost like a shopping cart religion. But what these films talk about is the fact that that religion and faith is something that is formula, it has a formula, it has ritual, it has power, and it has power because it's communally practiced. So in some ways, it doesn't necessarily jibe with, when you look at the people of Summer Isle, they're not hippies in the way, in the same way that you would think of, Haight Ashbury, for example.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. When you said that, I just had that image of Christopher Lee at one point in the film with his long hair and the pagan paint on his face, or kind of a
Hmm.
pagan hippie motif thing going
Yeah.
on there. Yeah, which is interesting. Um,
Hmm.
in the past, for example, in the 1950s, films were produced to reinforce the cultural and social status quo, and so you've got as you know, Christianity is depicted positively, overcoming evil. Nowadays, we've got a very different situation where you've even got pagan consultants on horror films, and
Sure.
you've got pagan scholars writing books. I've got
Mhm.
a Wiccan friend of mine who writes about books about how witchcraft has been depicted over the various decades. But during this time period, why do you think that film studios, directors, and audiences were willing to look at paganism, Satanism, and witchcraft in a slightly different kind of way than in prior times?
Yeah, I think it just has to do with this idea of the whole religious discourse opening up. Um, so, like I said, you have these iconic figures like Mick Jagger and people writing like with sympathy for the devil and things like this. You have Kenneth Anger reaching out to the artistic communities. You have the feminist discourse opening up, and remember what Wicca ultimately is worshiping Mother Earth and the idea of feminine power existing. And so you, rather than worshiping the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, you have the matriarch Trinity, right? And you have this, so you have all of these things kind of riding on these ideas of opening up of the discourses, of opening up of alternative forms of belief. But as you said, I think that also, um even so, you have people like Anton LaVey being enlisted to give support for films. Like he consulted on some films. You have Wicca practitioners giving their, making sure that the films are at least in some ways adhering to some semblance of the original and the proper practices. Um, and certainly that had happened in the late 1960s and 1970s. But what's really interesting is that you still have this idea of um, this need, the need for belief, the need for religious congregationalism in some ways, and this idea of you need to form communities. And that's something that I think in popular discourse was kind of is not really is a little bit lost. You have to have a system. You have to have kind of guidelines and structure and things, I think ultimately human beings need. We need to have something outside of ourselves to believe. And so, in some ways, where it is opening up the discourse, it's also calling for, I think these films ultimately call for a need for faith and a need for community, which is, and so that's why you have these congregations as not necessarily being the evildoers, but just being practitioners of an alternative religion. And which is why, regardless of whether you think that they're good or bad, they ultimately are able to vanquish because they have a power in numbers and a power in belief.
One of the films you take a look at, if you could say a little bit about, I remember seeing this in the theaters, the Omen,
Hmm.
And it was a great time. I also remember seeing the late great Planet Earth, based upon Hal Lindsey's so-called prophecy novels. So this idea of the end times and apocalypse was definitely in the air at the time. And then the Omen comes out, which has been called The Exorcist for Protestants, and
Exactly.
and it does something very different. Can you talk about the Omen?
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting about the Omen is that it was produced by a non horror director. So you have, Donner producing The Omen. You have it being, you have it with really big Hollywood stars. So you have, Thorne being played by Gregory Peck. You have Lee Remick. Then you have some kind of, also, as I said, with Rosemary's Baby as well, you have alternative actors coming to the fore as well. So it's really an interesting kind of discourse in terms of trying to kind of reach, again, because it's Hollywood, reach the widest possible audiences. Now, what's interesting about The Omen is the fact that it presents this idea once again about faith communities versus people who don't have a really strong belief in religion. So you have Thorne, Gregory Peck, Thorne, who is, he's up and coming in the world of politics, right? And his wife is in the movie, you kind of get the sense that she's maybe slightly unbalanced, but in the novelization that was written by Seltzer right after the film was made, um, she is very much kind of a troubled individual, and so she loses her baby. And so Thorne, in the kind of this altruistic moment where he's not thinking about like himself, he's actually thinking about his wife, what's best for her, is offered the opportunity to have a changeling and have this baby who was born at the exact same time as his baby be swapped, and he adopts the baby as his own without telling his wife, because he doesn't want his wife to be traumatized really by the death of their child. Problematic maybe, yes, but he does it for all the best reasons. And so what's interesting about it is that the reason why he accepts all this is because the people who are suggesting this, he's in Italy, right? He's in Rome. The people that are suggesting this are garbed in the robes of Christianity, of Catholicism, right? So you think that these are Catholic priests that are saying, "Oh, look, here's this child. God has given you a son, on this day," and it's almost as if this is fate. This is what God wants for you. And because they are garbed in these traditional robes, and because Thorne isn't quite aware of really the machinations of it all, because he isn't religious particularly, he accepts it. And and then you come to realize that God gave him a son, but it's not the God you're thinking of. It's actually Satan is giving him a son, and it's all set out in a prophecy, right? And that's what's kind of interesting about The Omen, is that even it pits Satanism against Christianity, but it's very apocryphal. It's very prophetic. So this is something that is handed down, that from all time, just as Christ was always meant to be born in this particular way, and the signs are there to suggest that this is where he's going to come from and what he needs to do in order to make himself known as the Christ. Same thing is true with the Antichrist, right? He has to be born in this way, and these are the signs, and this is what's going to happen. And so again, Satanism is portrayed as being this prophetic faith that adheres to doctrine and laws and rules. And even though, so you even have the people that are garbed in traditional faith, almost as if Satanism is like the kind of other of Catholicism. It's like the kind of the flip side of the coin, because they ultimately are coterminous. They started out almost at the same time, right? And so what's interesting about the Omen is the fact that because Peck isn't, he isn't particularly a faithful man. But he comes to understand the fact that his child is the Antichrist, and realizes, after everything else has been taken away from him, that Damien has to die, right? But he does it obviously on his own, and and in the kind of the final scene of the film, what's happening, but from the outside perspective, it looks like infanticide, and of course he ends up, okay, spoiler alert, he ends up getting shot by the police, right? and but then you have this, but the final scene of the film is Damien standing with the president and his wife. So that he's going to arise from the world of politics, and he just moved a step up, right? So he was with Thorne, and Thorne was probably going to be the president one day, to actually, now he's going to be adopted by the president. And so it kind of ends there, suggesting that it is going to be the battle that was set out in the Bible, as was portrayed in the Omen. And of course, everybody nailed the Omen for that. You don't even get the book of the Bible right. That isn't even in the Bible at all. It's not real. It's you're telling tale. And so it was. So everybody kind of really derided the film for that, without really realizing the fact that it was doing a lot of really interesting things with playing with the notion of belief and the necessity for it, and how, again, self-sacrifice and the sacrifice for your faith is going to have kind of just desserts. It's going to be, in some ways, I think it's rewarded in these films ultimately. Now, of course, there were two other films that came subsequently. I think that in some ways, The Omen 3, as much as it's not a bad little film, it's almost kind of apologetic in some ways. I think it's like, okay, well, okay, so now we're just going to have it. Everything's going to end up on a good note. But of course, then it was getting into the 1980s, when the whole discourse was changing, and we were turning from a more opening up of alternatives to a much more conservative culture. But if you look at the Omen film, just in and of itself, it's doing so many interesting things within a very, very ultimately Hollywood. It's a very kind of, in some ways, conservative discourse, because it's not trying to alienate anybody. It's trying to do the kind of the lowest common denominator when it comes to any sort of controversy. And I think The Omen can be seen to be somewhat of a little controversial film when you look at it, in that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, that final scene where Damien, between his new presidential parents, turns around and looks right at the audience, breaks down, the wall, and has that little smile to, it's just a great piece. And as a teenager watching it in the theaters, to see the for those who maybe haven't seen it, the sliding glass that takes off the head in slow motion from multiple angles was just great stuff. Had nothing to do with the plot or anything, but it was all good stuff. So it's a great little film. One final question for you, and then if there's anything I'm missing that you would like to bring out. We're in a time now where you've got increasing numbers of people are pushing back against Christian hegemony in America and the West. The so-called alternative religions, many times now, have become mainstream and are pushing for their place in the public square, and to have self-representation and a place in the dialogue and so on. So it seems to me that these films that you're analyzing here aren't just an area of historical and cinematic interest. They have something significant to say to us today. What would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, so I think the final chapter in my book talks about the fact that we're kind of having a resurgence of kind of faith horror. And so you have things like The Conjuring, where you have the Warrens who are going to do some stone cold ghosting, and and go out and deal with the Amityville horror and with Enfield haunting and stuff like that, but are motivated by their Catholic faith in doing this, and they believe that God has brought them together to do this. If you read the Warrens' book, um, Ed Warren talks about the fact, and he actually makes note of the fact that there is a difference between Wicca and Satanism, and that just because you're practicing the Wiccan faith doesn't necessarily mean that you are trying to conjure up the demonic, and the demonic is a very different thing from what is happening with Wicca. It's kind of, I think, in some ways muted in the film, when you have, again, Bathsheba being thought of as being kind of a demonic entity rather than, you know. And then you have these other kind of films that are coming up that are also dealt with. I think a lot of people deal with them in terms of folk horror. So you have films like Jughead, where you have this kind of insular community that has this idea of whoever the jug looks like is going to have to be the person that's going to be sacrificed. So there's this kind of return to faith in films. And just like I think the 1970s was kind of a moment of change, as you move from kind of the end of modernism to the beginning of postmodernism, when you have this kind of shift and you have this kind of opening up of alternatives in terms of religion. I think that right now we're at an interesting moment when it comes to faith and belief. And obviously at the advent of September 11th, and where religion is in some ways, it can be sometimes demonized by the popular press that looks at ultra radical fundamentalism as being, as so when you say you're religious, people ought to maybe kind of start to get back. Oh, you like, are you gonna like bomb my house, or are you gonna like attack the the abortion clinic, like, or are you gonna like, to be religious is in some ways to be like, people kind of, I think, are a little bit of take a step back from religion. It's kind of lost what religion is there for, which is about love and acceptance and something outside the self, believing in the ultimate purpose of humanity, to be there for love and acceptance. And you see a lot of what the popular press and the people who are doing things in the name of religion, doing something that's very much the opposite. And sadly, that is opening up another kind of dialogue that's happening right now. And so it's a time of really interesting things that are happening in terms of faith and religion and belief. That opens up another kind of interesting discourse that you're seeing being played out in another kind of set of post 9/11 films. I haven't really spent a huge amount of time doing a lot of extensive research like I did in the 1970s, but I think that would be something that I'd like to explore, because I kind of just use it as kind of as an aside, or as an afterword to faith horror, saying that these issues are still very much present today. But I think that obviously I'd like to either hand the torch over to somebody else, or to maybe do some work and just saying that these are interesting discussions that are still being played out in horror films, because horror films ultimately, I say, are a lot of them, the majority of them, are ultimately about faith and religion and belief.
Yeah, thankfully there have been a number of scholars who have recognized that and have been exploring the richness and that that are in horror films. So
Yeah, yeah.
is there anything that I haven't gotten to, would you like to bring out about your book for folks?
So yeah, you talk about the idea of the 1970s as being something that opens up alternatives and things like that. Um, and something that actually I would like to again explore for a future book is this idea of it's not only the time of Satanism, paganism, and witchcraft, but also the time of religious fundamentalism. And you have people like Jerry Falwell, you have people like televangelism kind of coming on the scene, and I think that opens up an interesting another interesting topic. And one of the things that I was kind of playing around with when I was doing this book was looking at something like Carrie, and this idea, and so you have the mom as being this sort of very religious fundamentalist who locks her daughter in a cupboard with an icon, um when she gets her period, because obviously the blood is like sinful nature of woman and stuff like this. And so there's also this kind of element that is, I think, it's also interesting to explore, and something that you can see coming through in films. I also have a friend who wrote a book called Horror Noir, which talks about the black exploitation films of this period, and how a lot of African Americans specifically, if they are portrayed in these films, one of the sort of go-to stereotypes is the voodoo priestess or the voodoo priest, and how they were another group that were meant to be defeated. Right? We gotta kill those voodoo priests because they're evil. But then you have films like Sugar Hill or something like that, where um, they actually are efficacious in their belief, and people kind of turn to them for help and guidance and power. And I think this is also another interesting area. So Satanism, paganism, and witchcraft is basically a starting off point for a whole discourse that's just so ripe and so fruitful and so diverse. So I feel like I'm just kind of in this book I've kind of just touched the surface, and I'd like to see if, and I'm reading now about all different kinds of people who are exploring other avenues in this particular kind of thread of horror scholarship.
Well, we've had the privilege of discussing horror noir here at Theo Fantastique as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, well, it sounds like you've got some other research interests, and my hope is that that's how it starts, right? It always
Hmm.
starts as areas of research, and the next thing you know, McFarland is knocking, and you've got another book in the works. So my hope is that is the case. I want to direct folks' attention to the program notes. You'll find a description and a link for this book. Again, it's Faith Horror, Cinematic Visions of Satanism, Paganism, Witchcraft, 1966 to 1978. And my guest in conversation again today has been LMK Sheppard. Thank you so much for coming on and making time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have a good day, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. Tune back here to Theo Fantastic periodically for these kinds of conversations and commentary and all kinds of things. And until our next conversation.